The June afternoon lay soft and golden across the grounds of Melford Manor, where the annual village hospital garden fete had transformed the usually sedate lawns into a cheerful maze of striped tents and chattering crowds. Miss Jane Marple sat peacefully beside the white elephant stall, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of long practice as she observed the gentle chaos of village charity at its most determined. The air was sweet with the scent of strawberry jam and the particular mixture of excitement and mild panic that always attended such events. It was Mrs. Emmeline Pierce, the widow who had graciously offered her grounds for the occasion, who had donated the curious mirror now holding court in the ladies' powder tent. A tall cheval glass, with an oval face, its silvering had grown thin and spotted with age, giving it an eccentric personality that reflected faces in fragments. An eye here, a smile there, as if it had grown selective about what it chose to remember. "The wretched thing has forgotten how to behave properly," declared Mrs. Winifred Nash, who had volunteered to supervise the powdering and primping for a shilling. "It shows you bits of yourself when it pleases, like a cat that only purrs when it wants something." Miss Marple found herself watching the small dramas that unfolded around the mirror with quiet interest. There was something almost theatrical about how people approached it, as if they expected it to reveal secrets rather than simply reflect their faces. Mrs. Isabel Vane, the striking widow who had recently taken the old rectory, had spent considerable time before the glass that morning, tilting her head this way and that with an expression of amused frustration. "It refuses to show me properly," she had laughed to Mrs. Nash, her voice carrying that particular musical quality that made men pause in their conversations. "Perhaps it has forgotten my face entirely." The comment had seemed innocent enough, but Miss Marple, whose long experience had taught her that the most revealing remarks often came disguised as pleasantries, tucked it away in that corner of her mind where such observations lived quietly until they became useful. She had noticed other things too, how Lionel Pierce, Mrs. Pierce's stepson, lingered near the powder tent with the studied casualness of a man who wished to appear accidental, how Dr. Felix Morland kept glancing toward Mrs. Vane with the worried expression he usually reserved for patients, how young Daphne Rowe, recently engaged to the grocer's son, watched Mrs. Vane with the mixture of admiration and unease that pretty girls often felt toward women who wielded beauty like a professional tool. The afternoon progressed with the gentle predictability of such events. Colonel Hartley won the guest the weight of the cheese through what appeared to be military strategy rather than luck. The Reverend Greeley beamed benevolently over the cake stall, while his wife counted spoons with the precision of a quartermaster. Children shrieked with delight at the Punch and Judy show, and the village photographer from Much Benham set up his camera beneath the copper beech, offering portrait sittings for a shilling each. It was perhaps 3 o'clock when Miss Marple noticed the subtle change in atmosphere that preceded significant events. The chatter seemed to pause for just a moment, like birds falling silent before a storm. From the powder tent came a sound that was not quite a scream, but something sharper and more alarming, the kind of cry that cuts through polite afternoon conversation like a knife through silk. Mrs. Nash emerged from the tent with her face pale and her usual composure entirely abandoned. "Dr. Morland," she called, her voice carrying across the lawn with unusual urgency. "Please, someone fetch Dr. Morland immediately." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the quiet efficiency that had served her well through decades of village crises. She made her way through the gathering crowd, noting how people pressed forward with that mixture of concern and curiosity that attends all disasters, whether great or small. Inside the powder tent, the striped canvas walls seemed to press close around a scene that belonged in no cheerful afternoon gathering. Mrs. Isabel Vane lay crumpled beside the ornate mirror, which had been turned to face the canvas wall as if someone could not bear what it might reflect. Her elegant summer dress was disarranged, and her usually perfect hair had come loose from its pins. The mirror's silvered surface, Miss Marple noticed, bore a spider web of cracks across its center, as though something had struck it with considerable force. Dr. Morland arrived within moments, his medical bag in hand, and his worried expression now focused with professional purpose. He knelt beside Mrs. Vane, his fingers seeking the pulse at her throat, then moving to check for signs of life with the gentle thoroughness that marked him as a man who had delivered both good news and bad with equal compassion. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Mrs. Pierce first, then swept across the small crowd that had gathered despite Mrs. Nash's attempts to maintain some privacy. "I'm afraid she's dead," he said quietly, the words falling into the perfumed air of the tent like stones into still water. Miss Marple stood very still, her eyes taking in details that others might overlook in their shock. Mrs. Vane's gloves lay on the small dressing table, but they were arranged oddly, left over right in a way that suggested haste or distraction. A lipstick had rolled against the mirror's base, its golden case catching the filtered light that came through the canvas. Most curious of all, the powder compact lay open, its contents disturbed by what appeared to be a hasty, uneven application. "The mirror," whispered Daphne Rowe, who had been the one to discover the scene. "I turned it around. I couldn't bear to see. It made her look so strange, all broken up like that." Miss Marple nodded gently, understanding the girl's distress, but she found herself wondering about the timing of things, about the sequence of events that had led to this tragic tableau. The mirror that had forgotten faces had become, in its final act, a witness to something far more serious than vanity or the gentle deceptions of age. As the crowd murmured and Dr. Morland began the somber business of determining what had befallen the beautiful Mrs. Vane, Miss Marple quietly observed the faces around her. In her long experience, she had learned that the moments immediately following a tragedy often revealed more about human nature than hours of careful questioning. Someone in this tent, or among the cheerful crowd still enjoying strawberries and cream outside, knew more about Mrs. Vane's death than they were likely to admit. The mirror might have forgotten faces, but Miss Marple had never forgotten that in villages like theirs, secrets had a way of reflecting back when one knew how to look for them. The tent held its breath, while Dr. Morland conducted his examination with the careful thoroughness that marked his years of practice. He asked for space, and Mrs. Nash fluttered nervously as the canvas door fell back with a tremulous sigh. Outside, the fête's cheerful chatter resumed in puzzled undertones, like birds testing the air after an unexpected disturbance. Miss Marple remained quietly in the background, her hands folded peacefully on her handbag, though her gentle eyes missed nothing of the scene before her. Dr. Morland's movements were competent rather than theatrical, as he noted the details that duty required. The broken mirror with its spider web of cracks, the careful arrangement of Mrs. Vane's personal items, the curious neatness of her position that seemed inconsistent with a sudden collapse. When he examined the powder compact that lay open on the small dressing table, his fingers paused at the texture of the powder itself. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself, noting how the substance felt oddly gritty between his fingers, quite unlike the fine cosmetic powder one would expect. He closed the compact with a decisive click and found his eyes meeting Miss Marple's observant gaze. "I wonder," Miss Marple said softly, as if wondering were merely an innocent pastime like choosing knitting patterns, "whether someone ought to fetch a chair for Mrs. Nash. The poor dear looks quite ready to faint." It was the sort of practical suggestion that sent people bustling about helpfully, and in the gentle reshuffling that followed, Miss Marple found herself positioned where she could observe the dressing table more closely. The lipstick in its golden case bore a tiny dent on the cap that suggested teeth rather than accident, while the gloves arranged left over right made a tidy bundle that spoke of either haste or habit. Young Daphne Rowe stood at the tent entrance, pale but determined not to give way to tears. "There was the oddest smell when I found her," she said quietly to Miss Marple, grateful for a kind face in the midst of the chaos. "Something sweet but medicinal, not like the usual powder and perfume scents one expects in a lady's tent. She paused, then added with the honesty that marked her character. Mrs. Vane had said the powder made her look ghostly, that it wasn't quite her shade. And then it happened so quickly, almost as if... She trailed off, unable to voice the terrible possibility that had begun to form in her mind. News of the tragedy spread through the garden fete with the peculiar velocity that shocking events possess in small communities. Within minutes, the cheerful bustle had transformed into hushed clusters of conversation, each group developing its own theory about what had befallen the beautiful Mrs. Vane. Miss Marple, having quietly slipped from the tent, positioned herself near the tea stall where Mrs. Dorothy Hartley was dispensing both Earl Grey and explanations with equal authority. "Mark my words, it was her heart," Mrs. Hartley declared, with the confidence of someone who had diagnosed half the village's ailments over the years. A woman living alone in that great rambling house, the strain must have been considerable. And she was always so particular about her appearance, the shock of seeing herself in that dreadful broken mirror might have been quite enough to bring on an attack. But Mrs. Gladys Rowe, Daphne's mother, harbored darker suspicions. "I always said there was something not quite right about that woman," she whispered, leaning closer to the small circle that had formed. Living in the old rectory like that, with no proper family connections, no references from her previous residence, and the way she dressed, always so perfectly turned out, as if she were expecting to be photographed at any moment. A widow's pension doesn't stretch to silk dresses and motor cars, does it? The Reverend Greeley cleared his throat diplomatically. "We must be charitable in our judgments, Mrs. Rowe. Mrs. Vane was always most generous with her contributions to the Church Restoration Fund." But even his gentle rebuke carried an undertone of uncertainty, as if he too had wondered about the source of her apparent prosperity. Miss Marple observed these exchanges with the quiet attention of someone sorting through a particularly complex knitting pattern. She noted how quickly sympathy had transformed into suspicion, how the village's need to make sense of tragedy had immediately focused on Mrs. Vane's circumstances rather than on who might have wished her harm. It was a pattern she had observed many times before. When death arrived unexpectedly, people sought explanations that restored order to their disrupted world. Lionel Pierce, Mrs. Pierce's stepson, had made himself notably absent from the immediate vicinity of the tragedy, though Miss Marple glimpsed him near the main house, speaking in low tones, with someone she couldn't quite identify from her position. His absence struck her as curious behavior for a man whose stepmother was hosting the event, particularly when duty would normally require his presence during such a crisis. The arrival of Constable Pierce from the village station brought an official gravity to the proceedings that crystallized everyone's growing awareness that this was no simple medical emergency. The constable, more accustomed to lost property and minor disturbances than sudden death, approached his duties with earnest determination, quickly cordoning off the powder tent and sending word to Inspector Slack in much Benham. "I'll need to speak with anyone who had contact with the deceased this afternoon," Constable Pierce announced to the assembled crowd, his notebook at the ready, particularly those who were present in or near the powder tent before the discovery of the body. Miss Marple watched the subtle shifts in posture and expression that accompanied this announcement. Some people pressed forward with the eager helpfulness of those who relished being part of important events, while others seemed to draw back, as if proximity to official inquiry made them uncomfortable. The afternoon that had begun with the innocent pleasures of charity and community was rapidly becoming something far more complex, and she could sense the undercurrents of anxiety that such transformations invariably produced. As the constable began his preliminary interviews, Miss Marple settled herself on a garden bench where she could observe without appearing to do so. In her long experience, the moments immediately following a tragedy often revealed more about human nature than hours of formal questioning. Someone among these concerned villagers knew more about Mrs. Vane's death than they were likely to admit readily, and she intended to watch very carefully indeed for the small signs that might point her toward the truth. The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham brought an immediate transformation to the afternoon's tragic proceedings. A man of solid build and methodical temperament, he approached the powder tent with the unhurried competence that marked his years of experience in criminal investigation. His keen grey eyes took in the scene with professional detachment, though Miss Marple, observing from her garden bench, noted the slight tightening around his mouth that suggested he found the circumstances more troubling than he cared to reveal. Dr. Morland met the inspector at the tent entrance, his medical bag still clutched in hands that showed the faint tremor of a man delivering unwelcome news. "Inspector, I must recommend treating this as more than a natural death," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of professional certainty. "The physical evidence suggests poisoning. There's an unusual grittiness to the powder in Mrs. Vane's compact, and Miss Rowe mentioned a distinctive odor, sweet but with an underlying medicinal quality that reminded me rather unpleasantly of bitter almonds." The inspector's examination of the tent was thorough and methodical. He studied the broken mirror with its spider web of cracks, noted the precise arrangement of Mrs. Vane's gloves, and examined the dented lipstick case with particular attention. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression had settled into the grave concentration that accompanied serious criminal investigation. "Constable Pierce, I'll need this area sealed completely. No one enters without my direct permission." Young Daphne Rowe's testimony came forth with the clarity that often accompanies shock, though her voice trembled as she recounted the details. "Mrs. Vane seemed perfectly well when I first saw her around 2:30, she explained, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She was arranging her hair and applying powder, chatting pleasantly about how lovely the grounds looked. But when I returned, perhaps 20 minutes later, to retrieve my gloves, I found her collapsed beside the dressing table. That strange, sweet smell was quite overwhelming, and the mirror had somehow been turned to face the wall." Mrs. Nash, still fluttering with distress but determined to provide every detail, offered her account with the precision that marked her character. "Mrs. Vane used her own powder compact, Inspector, not the communal one we keep for ladies who might need touching up. She was always very particular about such things. Just before I left to fetch change from the cash box, Mrs. Hartley can vouch for that errand, Mrs. Vane mentioned that her powder seemed different somehow, that it made her look rather ghastly and wasn't her usual shade." The Reverend Greeley approached with obvious reluctance, his usual benevolent demeanor clouded by the weight of what he felt compelled to reveal. "I believe I must mention that Mrs. Vane sought me out this morning before the fete began," he said carefully. "She seemed quite agitated, though she wouldn't specify the cause. She asked whether I believed in redemption for past sins, and whether someone who had lived under false pretenses might still find peace with their conscience. When I assured her that divine forgiveness was available to all who sought it sincerely, she seemed unconvinced. She mentioned something rather curious about mirrors showing more than faces, though I confess I didn't understand her meaning at the time." This revelation cast Mrs. Vane's final moments in an entirely different light, suggesting that whatever had befallen her might have been connected to secrets from her past rather than the random malice of a stranger. Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the phrase about mirrors showing more than faces, wondering whether it referred to the physical looking-glass in the tent or to some metaphorical reflection that had been troubling the beautiful widow's conscience. It was at this point that Lionel Pierce, finally, made his appearance, approaching the group with the careful manner of a man who knew his every gesture would be scrutinized. His explanation for his earlier absence seemed rehearsed rather than natural. "I was attending to some estate matters in the morning room, then speaking with the photographer about the arrangements for the prize-giving ceremony," he offered, though his eyes didn't quite meet the inspector's steady gaze. When pressed for more specific details, his account became increasingly vague, and several villagers confirmed that he had been seen near the powder tent shortly before the discovery of Mrs. Vane's body. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened considerably at these revelations. "Mr. Pierce, you were observed in the vicinity of the tent, yet you made no attempt to assist when the alarm was raised. Can you explain this apparent contradiction?" The question hung in the afternoon air like a challenge, and Lionel's response, something about feeling unwell from the heat and needing a quiet walk, carried little conviction. Miss Marple, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, observed this exchange with the quiet attention of someone sorting through a particularly complex pattern. While Lionel Pierce's behavior was undeniably suspicious, something in his manner suggested the awkwardness of a man caught in an embarrassing situation rather than the calculated composure of a murderer. She found herself more intrigued by smaller details that others seemed to overlook. The fact that Mrs. Vane had apparently been using a different powder compact than her usual one. The precise arrangement of her gloves in a manner that seemed inconsistent with her natural habits, and the curious timing of events that placed her death during the brief window when the tent was unattended. The village photographer, a nervous man named Rudge who had been setting up his equipment beneath the copper beech, provided what might prove to be crucial evidence. "I was adjusting my camera around 2:30 when I noticed Mrs. Vane in conversation with someone near the rose walk," he explained, his hands shaking slightly as he handled his photographic plates. "I couldn't see the other person clearly, just a shoulder and the brim of a hat, but they seemed to be having quite an intense discussion. I may have captured the tent entrance in one of my candid shots around 3 o'clock, if that would be helpful to your investigation." Inspector Slack directed him to develop the photographs immediately, though he cautioned against expecting too much from such evidence. Still, Miss Marple noted with interest that someone had been careful to meet with Mrs. Vane in a relatively private location shortly before her death, suggesting a level of premeditation that cast the entire afternoon's events in a more sinister light. As the inspector continued his methodical questioning of the assembled villagers, a pattern began to emerge that painted Mrs. Vane in a rather different light than her elegant appearance might have suggested. Old Mr. Finch from the post office mentioned a recent large withdrawal of money, while Mrs. Ridley spoke of forceful opinions and sharp disagreements during church committee meetings. The beautiful widow, it seemed, had not been universally beloved, despite her charm and generous contributions to village causes. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the manor grounds as the investigation proceeded, transforming what had begun as a celebration of community spirit into something far more troubling. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting how quickly sympathy had given way to suspicion, how eagerly people offered theories that cast blame on others while carefully distancing themselves from any involvement. In her long experience, she had learned that the moments following a tragedy often revealed more about human nature than hours of formal questioning, and she intended to remember every nuance of behavior that might later prove significant. Inspector Slack's preliminary conclusion seemed to focus increasingly on Lionel Pierce, whose nervous demeanor and convenient absence made him the most obvious suspect. But Miss Marple, watching the interplay of personalities and remembering the small inconsistencies that had caught her attention, remained unconvinced that the solution would prove quite so straightforward. The mirror that had forgotten faces had reflected something significant that afternoon, though perhaps not in the way anyone might have expected. Inspector Slack's methodical examination of the powder tent yielded disturbing evidence that transformed the afternoon's tragedy into something far more sinister. Dr. Morland's preliminary findings confirmed what the bitter almond scent had suggested. Mrs. Vane had been poisoned by cyanide mixed into face powder, creating a lethal cosmetic that would have been virtually undetectable until applied. The precision required for such a method spoke of careful premeditation and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. The development of Mr. Rudge's photographs provided the investigation's first concrete breakthrough. The nervous photographer emerged from his makeshift darkroom in the manor's pantry, clutching damp prints with trembling hands. "The light wasn't ideal, Inspector. he explained apologetically, but this exposure taken just before 3 o'clock shows the powder tent entrance quite clearly. The image revealed a blurred figure near the tent, identifiable primarily by build and posture as someone of Lionel Pierce's general appearance, though the angle made absolute identification impossible. More significantly, Miss Marple's gentle inquiries among the witnesses had uncovered a crucial detail that the official investigation had initially overlooked. Mrs. Nash, steadier now after tea and sympathy, confirmed with absolute certainty that Mrs. Vane's usual compact was blue enamel with a distinctive chip on the edge. "I noticed particularly because mine is nearly identical," she explained. "But the compact in the tent was black lacquer, much heavier, and the powder puff felt strangely new." When Constable Pierce retrieved Mrs. Vane's handbag from the old rectory, the blue enamel compact lay within, its contents pristine and untouched. Clear evidence that someone had deliberately substituted the poisoned compact for Mrs. Vane's usual one. Inspector Slack's interrogation of Lionel Pierce had grown increasingly pointed as contradictions mounted in the young man's account. His explanation for being near the powder tent remained frustratingly vague, and when pressed about his financial circumstances, his composure cracked entirely. Mrs. Pierce, questioned privately about her stepson's recent behavior, reluctantly revealed troubling details about mysterious letters, angry telephone conversations about money, and unexplained trips to London that had left Lionel increasingly agitated. The investigation took another disturbing turn when Dr. Morland reported that Mrs. Vane had recently made inquiries about certain estate matters that should have been straightforward rental arrangements. "She seemed particularly concerned about the proper handling of her payments," he explained to Inspector Slack. "She mentioned something about discrepancies that troubled her, though she wouldn't elaborate on the specifics." This revelation cast Lionel's financial difficulties in a more sinister light, suggesting that Mrs. Vane might have discovered irregularities that threatened to expose his desperate circumstances. Young Daphne Rowe, still shaken by her discovery of the body, provided testimony that further complicated Lionel's position. "I saw him near the powder tent much earlier than he claimed," she admitted reluctantly. "It was around 2:30, just after Mrs. Vane had gone in to freshen up. He seemed to be waiting for something, checking his pocket watch repeatedly and glancing toward the tent entrance. When he saw me approaching, he walked away quickly toward the house." Her account directly contradicted Lionel's insistence that he had only passed by the tent briefly, while feeling unwell. Miss Marple, maintaining her position of quiet observation, found herself increasingly intrigued by details that others dismissed as insignificant. The arrangement of Mrs. Vane's gloves, left over right in a manner that suggested haste rather than her usual careful habits, struck her as particularly telling. More curious still was a faint crescent-shaped smear of powder on the mirror's frame at shoulder height, where someone had brushed against it while turning the glass to face the wall. The smear contained a tiny scratch that might have been made by a ring or brooch, though determining which ornament among the afternoon's many accessories had caused it would require careful observation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the manor grounds, Inspector Slack appeared to be building a compelling case against Lionel Pierce based on opportunity, financial motive, and increasingly suspicious behavior. The young man's nervous demeanor and contradictory statements had made him the obvious suspect in the eyes of both the law and the assembled villagers. Mrs. Hartley nodded sagely at each revelation, while the Reverend Greeley shook his head sadly at the apparent confirmation of human frailty. However, Miss Marple, remembering the small inconsistencies that had caught her attention throughout the afternoon, remained unconvinced that the solution would prove quite so straightforward. The mirror that had forgotten faces seemed an increasingly apt metaphor for a crime that involved careful deception and misdirection. Someone among the gathered villagers possessed knowledge they had not yet revealed, and she intended to watch very carefully indeed for the moment when that knowledge might inadvertently surface. In her long experience, the most obvious explanation was often merely a convenient distraction from the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of human nature's more complex motivations. The Manor's morning room had been transformed into an impromptu headquarters for Inspector Slack's investigation, with Mr. Rudge's photographic plates spread across Mrs. Pierce's polished mahogany table like pieces of a complex puzzle. The nervous photographer emerged from his makeshift darkroom in the pantry, clutching damp prints with hands that trembled slightly from both the chemicals and the gravity of his evidence. The exposure times were challenging with those shifting clouds, he explained apologetically. But this plate taken at 2:52 shows the powder tent entrance quite clearly. The photograph revealed a blurred figure adjusting something near the tent, identifiable primarily by posture and the glint of what appeared to be jewelry on one hand. Inspector Slack studied the image with professional intensity, while the assembled witnesses leaned forward with poorly concealed curiosity. The light caught something on the person's finger, Rudge continued, pointing to a small bright spot in the grainy image. Could be a ring or perhaps a brooch, though the angle makes it difficult to determine which. Miss Marple, positioned modestly near the fireplace where she could observe without appearing intrusive, found herself particularly interested in this detail. "How fortunate that you captured such a clear moment," she remarked gently to young Daphne Rowe, who stood nearby with her hands clasped tightly. "When you discovered poor Mrs. Vane and turned that dreadful mirror to the wall, were you wearing your engagement ring, my dear?" Daphne shook her head with the quick certainty of someone who had already considered the question. "No, Miss Marple. I'd taken it off earlier and threaded it on my chain. It catches on my gloves otherwise. I only put it back on after we'd called for help." She touched the chain, at her throat where the ring lay hidden beneath her collar, confirming her account with unconscious honesty. Miss Marple's gentle gaze moved thoughtfully around the room, taking in the various accessories worn by the ladies present. Mrs. Nash, who had been hovering with characteristic efficiency over the tea arrangements, wore her usual collection of practical jewelry, including a distinctive marcasite ring on her right hand. The ring formed an elegant crescent shape, though Miss Marple noted with quiet interest that one of the small stones appeared to be missing, leaving a tiny, sharp prong that would easily catch on delicate fabrics or scratch polished surfaces. Dr. Morland, who had maintained his position slightly apart from the main group, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Inspector, I feel I should mention that Mrs. Vane sought me out this morning before the fete began. She seemed quite agitated about something, though she wouldn't specify the nature of her concerns. She did ask rather urgently about updating certain legal documents and mentioned feeling that past matters were catching up with her in ways she hadn't anticipated." This revelation cast Mrs. Vane's final hours in a more troubling light, suggesting that her death might have been connected to secrets from her previous life, rather than the immediate village circumstances that had made Lionel Pierce the obvious suspect. Inspector Slack's interrogation of the young man continued in the adjacent study, but the sound of increasingly confident questioning suggested that the inspector believed he had found his murderer. Mrs. Pierce drifted anxiously between the official proceedings and her duties as hostess, her usual composure strained by the afternoon's terrible events. "Lionel has always been highly strung," she explained to anyone who would listen. "The heat and all this dreadful business. It's quite overwhelmed his nerves. He's not naturally suited to such intense scrutiny." Miss Marple observed these exchanges with the patient attention of someone sorting through a particularly complex knitting pattern. The timing of Mr. Rudge's photograph at 2:52, combined with the various testimonies about who had been where and when, created a framework within which the afternoon's tragedy had unfolded. Yet something about the sequence of events continued to trouble her, a small inconsistency that nagged at the edges of her consciousness like a dropped stitch that threatened to unravel an entire row. The crescent-shaped smear of powder she had noticed on the mirror's frame seemed increasingly significant, particularly when considered alongside the damaged ring that could easily have made such a mark. Someone had been close enough to the mirror to leave that trace, someone whose jewelry bore the distinctive shape that matched both the smear and the tiny scratch in the silvered surface. As Inspector Slack's voice rose and fell in the next room, building what sounded like an increasingly compelling case against Lionel Pierce, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the most obvious explanation might not be the most convenient distraction from a truth that lay hidden in smaller, more subtle details that only the most careful observer would notice. The mirror that had forgotten faces was beginning to reveal its secrets, though perhaps not in the way that anyone had expected. Inspector Slack's methodical questioning had built what appeared to be an increasingly solid case against Lionel Pierce, whose nervous contradictions and financial difficulties painted him as the obvious suspect in Mrs. Vane's death. The young man's presence near the powder tent at the crucial time, combined with his inability to provide a satisfactory alibi, seemed to satisfy both the inspector and the assembled villagers that justice would soon be served. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her quiet position near the morning room's tall windows, found herself troubled by small inconsistencies that refused to align with such a tidy conclusion. It was at this moment that Mr. Finch, the village postmaster, appeared at the manor's front door with the deliberate urgency of a man who recognized the gravity of his errand. He carried a yellow envelope and looked uncertainly among the assembled company before addressing Inspector Slack directly. "Beg pardon, sir, but this telegram arrived for Mrs. Vane just after the noon post. Given the circumstances, I thought it best you should see it immediately." The message, when Inspector Slack opened it with careful attention, contained only a few words that nonetheless cast the entire afternoon's events in a more sinister light. The telegram read simply, "Recognized at last. Coming today. Rose Walk, 2:30. H.B." The timing corresponded exactly with Mr. Rudge's account of seeing Mrs. Vane in intense conversation with someone near the rose garden, suggesting that she had indeed kept this mysterious appointment shortly before her death. Inspector Slack's pen moved quickly across his notebook as he questioned Mr. Finch about the message's origins, learning that it had been sent from London with priority delivery requested. Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the phrase, "recognized at last," which suggested that Mrs. Vane had been living under some form of concealment that had finally been penetrated. This revelation cast her earlier conversation with the Reverend Greeley about redemption and false pretenses in an entirely different light, implying that her agitation had stemmed from the discovery of her hidden identity rather than mere village concerns about financial irregularities. Dr. Morland, who had remained thoughtfully quiet during the official proceedings, approached Miss Marple with the confidence of someone sharing information with a trusted confidant. "I feel I should mention that Mrs. Vane sought me out early this morning before the fete began," he said in low tones. "She seemed quite distressed about something and asked rather urgently about updating certain legal documents. She mentioned feeling that past matters were catching up with her in ways she hadn't anticipated, and spoke of needing to make arrangements in case something happened to her. This conversation suggested that Mrs. Vane had possessed some premonition of danger, though whether from the mysterious H.B. or from someone closer to home remained unclear. Miss Marple noted with interest that the beautiful widow had apparently been preparing for the possibility of her own death, indicating that the afternoon's tragedy might have been the culmination of threats that had been building for some time. The investigation's focus on physical evidence had revealed several curious details that Inspector Slack seemed inclined to dismiss as coincidental. The crescent-shaped smear of powder on the mirror's frame, positioned at precisely the height where someone turning the glass would naturally place their hand, had caught Miss Marple's attention earlier. When she observed Mrs. Nash adjusting her marcasite ring with its missing stone, the tiny sharp prong that remained seemed perfectly suited to creating just such a mark on polished wood. Mrs. Nash herself had been notably helpful throughout the afternoon's proceedings, offering practical assistance and clear testimony about the timing of events. Yet Miss Marple had noticed that the efficient woman's usual composure occasionally slipped particularly when discussing her brief absence from the powder tent to fetch change from the house. The explanation was entirely reasonable and corroborated by Mrs. Hartley, but something in Mrs. Nash's manner suggested the kind of careful precision that often accompanied rehearsed accounts. Young Daphne Rowe, still shaken by her discovery of the body, provided an observation that seemed insignificant at first, but took on greater meaning in light of the telegram's implications. "Mrs. Vane mentioned yesterday that she was expecting an important visitor," she recalled hesitantly. She seemed both excited and nervous about the meeting, saying it would resolve certain matters that had been troubling her. She asked particularly about train schedules and whether there was reliable transportation from the station. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the manor grounds, and Inspector Slack prepared to transport Lionel Pierce to Much Benham for formal questioning, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution to Mrs. Vane's murder lay not in the obvious financial motives that had made the young man such a convenient suspect, but in the more complex web of secrets and deceptions that the telegram had begun to reveal. The mirror that had forgotten faces was indeed reflecting more than anyone had yet realized, and she suspected that the most crucial revelations were still to come. The mysterious H.B. had apparently succeeded in recognizing Mrs. Vane despite whatever disguise or deception she had employed, but whether this recognition had led directly to murder or had merely provided the catalyst for someone else's desperate action remained the central question that would determine where justice truly lay. The investigation into the telegram's origins led Inspector Slack and Miss Marple down the tree-lined lane toward the Blue Hare, where the afternoon's London train would have deposited any visitors seeking Melford Manor. The inn's modest facade, with its weathered sign swaying gently in the evening breeze, had witnessed countless arrivals over the years, though few as significant as the mysterious H.B., whose message had precipitated such tragic events. Mrs. Bidwell, the landlady, confirmed with characteristic efficiency that a gentleman had indeed arrived on the 2:10 train, inquired for directions to the manor, and returned shortly after 3 o'clock in a state of considerable agitation. "Nervous sort of fellow," she explained, leading them up the narrow stairs to the inn's best room. Asked for writing paper immediately and spent considerable time composing what appeared to be a rather difficult letter. Kept starting over, crumpling the pages, muttering to himself about consequences and proper procedures. When she knocked at the door, it opened to reveal a slight, carefully dressed man with thinning hair and the precise manner of someone accustomed to handling delicate legal matters. Harold Beamish, for that proved to be his name, required little encouragement to explain his presence in their village. He had recognized Mrs. Vane from a photograph in a charitable society bulletin, though he knew her not as Isabel Vane but as Marion Beckett, a former paid companion who had been dismissed under circumstances involving forged references and misappropriated funds. The scandal had been quietly managed to avoid publicity, but Beamish, as a clerk to the affected family's solicitors, had never forgotten the case or the woman whose deception had caused considerable distress to his elderly client. "I felt it my duty to confront her," he explained with the righteous determination of a man convinced of his moral position. "We met as arranged at 2:30 near the Rose Walk. She was terrified when she realized I had indeed recognized her, pleading for time to make arrangements, speaking of legal documents she wished to prepare. I told her I intended to write to Lady Pemberton, my former client, to inform her of Mrs. Beckett's current circumstances. She begged me to delay any communication until tomorrow, claiming she had important matters to settle first." Miss Marple listened to this account with the quiet attention she reserved for significant revelations, though something in Beamish's manner suggested he was withholding certain details. When Inspector Slack pressed him about his movements after leaving Mrs. Vane, his responses became notably less precise. He had returned to the inn, he insisted, and had remained there composing his letter until the constable's arrival with news of the tragedy. While Inspector Slack continued his questioning, Miss Marple excused herself for a brief walk in the inn's small garden, ostensibly to take some air after the afternoon's distressing events. In reality, she wished to examine the rose walk where the crucial meeting had taken place, knowing that significant conversations often left traces that careful observation might reveal. The gravel path showed signs of disturbance near a particularly dense thicket of climbing roses, where something heavy appeared to have been pressed into the ground and hastily withdrawn. More intriguing still was a small mother-of-pearl button partially hidden beneath the thorny branches, its delicate iridescence catching the fading light. The button was of excellent quality, the sort found on fine ladies' gloves or perhaps a gentleman's waistcoat, and its presence suggested that the meeting between Mrs. Vane and her blackmailer had been more physical than Beamish cared to admit. Miss Marple carefully retrieved the button, noting how its edges showed signs of having been torn away rather than simply lost through normal wear. Dr. Morland, who had been waiting anxiously at the manor for news of the investigation's progress, provided additional context when they returned with their discoveries. "Mrs. Vane sought me out early this morning," he revealed with obvious reluctance. "She was planning to leave Melford Manor immediately after the fete, tonight if possible. She spoke of someone from her past who had found her despite all her precautions, someone she described as vindictive and dangerous. Most significantly, she asked me to send a coded telegram to her London solicitor if anything should happen to her, a message that would begin with the very initials we found on today's telegram." This revelation cast Mrs. Vane's death in an entirely new light, suggesting that she had been aware of approaching danger and had taken precautions that might yet expose her killer. The beautiful widow had not been the helpless victim of random malice, but rather a woman who had prepared for the possibility of her own murder and had left behind clues that might ensure justice would eventually prevail. As evening settled over the village and Inspector Slack prepared to expand his investigation beyond the obvious suspect of Lionel Pierce, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution lay not in the dramatic revelations about Mrs. Vane's hidden past, but in the smaller details of human behavior that had played out under the innocent cover of a charity garden fete. The mirror that had forgotten faces was beginning to reflect a much more complex truth than anyone had initially imagined, and she suspected that the most crucial insights were still to come. Someone among their seemingly respectable gathering possessed knowledge they had not yet revealed, and the mother-of-pearl button now resting in her handbag might prove to be the key that unlocked the final secrets of this carefully planned deception. The evening shadows had begun to gather around Melford Manor when the investigation took a dramatic turn that transformed the afternoon's tragedy into something far more complex. Mr. Rudge emerged from his makeshift dark room in the manor's pantry with his face pale and his hands trembling violently, clutching the remnants of what had been crucial photographic evidence. "Inspector," he called urgently, his voice breaking with distress. "Someone's destroyed everything, every plate smashed, all the prints torn to pieces." Inspector Slack's examination of the sabotaged darkroom revealed a scene of deliberate destruction that spoke of desperate fur rather than random vandalism. The small window overlooking the side terrace had been forced with something thin and sharp, its catch bent back to allow silent entry. Glass plates lay shattered in their developing trays, and the acrid smell of spilled chemicals mingled with a faint, sweet scent that lingered in the air like an unwelcome presence. "When did you last secure this room?" the inspector demanded, his professional composure barely concealing his frustration at this setback. "Not 15 minutes ago," Rudge stammered, pressing a handkerchief to his mouth. "I lock the door as always when working with chemicals, but when I returned from fetching more paper, I glimpsed someone in a light-colored skirt disappearing around the corner toward the main house. There was a distinctive scent, too. Violets, I think, or perhaps lavender sachets." Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly during the commotion, found herself particularly intrigued by this detail. The deliberate destruction of photographic evidence suggested that someone believed those images contained more incriminating information than a mere blurred figure and the glint of jewelry. Such desperate measures spoke of a mind that understood exactly what the photographs might reveal and was prepared to take considerable risks to prevent their examination. While Inspector Slack coordinated the search for evidence around the forced window, Miss Marple requested permission for one final examination of the powder tent. The canvas enclosure, now dim in the evening light, held secrets that daylight observation might have missed. Beneath the dressing table, caught against a wooden leg by a protruding nail, she discovered a small wisp of cotton wool with a delicate thread of shell-pink silk embedded in its fibers. The fragment carried the same faint violet scent that had lingered in the sabotaged darkroom, suggesting a connection between the two locations that extended beyond mere coincidence. Dr. Morland approached Miss Marple with information that cast Mrs. Vane's final day in an even more troubling light. She mentioned someone she called her guardian angel, he revealed quietly. Someone who had been instrumental in helping her establish her new identity after the difficulties with her previous position. She seemed both grateful and concerned about this person's continued involvement in her affairs, as if their assistance had come with obligations she found increasingly burdensome. This revelation suggested that Mrs. Vane's deception had involved at least one accomplice whose own security might have been threatened by Harold Beamish's recognition of her true identity. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether this helpful individual might have had compelling reasons to ensure that Mrs. Vane's secrets remained permanently buried, reasons that could have led to the calculated murder they were investigating. Mrs. Pierce, still struggling to comprehend the afternoon's tragic events, provided another piece of the emerging puzzle. Mrs. Vane had been making inquiries about local families this past week, she revealed hesitantly. She seemed particularly interested in Mrs. Nash's background and circumstances, asking questions about how long she had lived in the village and what her previous employment had been. At the time, I thought it merely the natural curiosity of someone seeking to understand her new community. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Nash's reaction to this revelation with the careful attention she reserved for significant moments. The efficient woman's usual composure slipped noticeably, her hands trembling as she arranged teacups with unnecessary precision. Most tellingly, when Miss Marple gently complimented her elegant gloves, Mrs. Nash's response was uncharacteristically sharp, claiming that such observations were inappropriate given the circumstances. The left glove, Miss Marple noted, bore a small tear near the wrist where one of its mother-of-pearl buttons had been torn away, leaving only loose threads as evidence of its former presence. The missing button, combined with the cotton wool fragment and the violet scent that connected the powder tent to the sabotaged darkroom, began to form a pattern that pointed towards someone who had been present throughout the afternoon's events, moving quietly behind the scenes while maintaining the perfect facade of helpful efficiency. The mirror that had forgotten faces was beginning to reflect a truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, though Miss Marple suspected that the most crucial revelations were still to come. As Inspector Slack prepared to expand his investigation beyond the obvious suspects, Miss Marple found herself convinced that the solution lay not in dramatic confrontations or hidden identities, but in the quieter story of someone whose own carefully constructed world had been threatened by Mrs. Vane's presence. The beautiful widow's death had been neither random nor passionate, but the calculated act of someone who understood that exposure meant the destruction of everything they had built through years of patient deception. The evening had settled into an uneasy quiet when Mr. Rudge approached Inspector Slack with the hesitant manner of someone who feared his information might prove either crucial or embarrassing. "Inspector, there is something I should mention," he began, his ink-stained fingers working nervously at his waistcoat. "When I was testing exposures earlier, I made a small contact strip from the plate showing the tent entrance, merely to judge the contrast for proper development. I tucked it into my vest pocket and quite forgot about it until now." He produced a narrow slip of photographic paper, no larger than a bookmark, and handed it over with the reverence reserved for objects that might change everything. The contact strip, though small, proved remarkably eloquent. The figure by the tent was clearly not Lionel Pierce in his light summer coat, but rather a woman in a pale skirt, her forearm visible where a sleeve had been pushed back. At the wrist, 3 bright pinpoints formed a neat constellation where mother-of-pearl buttons caught the afternoon light, while above them, a darker glitter marked the distinctive crescent shape of a marcasite ring. The timing stamp on the strip corresponded exactly with the crucial period when the powder tent had been unattended, providing the first concrete evidence of who had been present at the moment of substitution. Miss Marple studied the image with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patient observations were finally bearing fruit. The photograph confirmed what the accumulated small details had suggested, but she understood that physical evidence alone would not be sufficient to expose the careful mind behind Mrs. Vane's murder. Inspector Slack, recognizing the significance of this discovery, began preparing for what would clearly be a delicate confrontation with someone who had maintained perfect composure throughout the afternoon's tragic events. It was at this moment that Miss Marple requested permission to return a shawl that Mrs. Nash had inadvertently left behind during the afternoon's confusion. The request seemed innocent enough, though Inspector Slack's growing familiarity with Miss Marple's methods made him suspect that such casual errands often yielded more significant results than formal interrogations. He agreed readily, understanding that gentle observation might succeed where direct questioning would only raise defenses. Mrs. Nash's cottage on Maple Row reflected the same careful efficiency that characterized its owner, with everything arranged in perfect order and the air scented with the violet sachets that she favored for keeping linens fresh. The sitting room, warm with lamplight and the comfortable smell of beeswax polish, contained a small work basket that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Shell-pink silk thread lay ready in a needle, while a packet of mother-of-pearl buttons rested nearby, their size and quality exactly matching the one that had been torn from a glove during some recent struggle. Most tellingly, a pair of gloves lay folded in the basket, the left cuff showing careful mending where a button had been hastily replaced with stitching that had not yet been pressed smooth. "These little buttons are quite the trial, aren't they?" Miss Marple observed with gentle sympathy, as if sharing a universal feminine concern. One always finds oneself searching in the gravel when they pop off at inconvenient moments. Mrs. Nash's response came too quickly, her laugh carrying a brittle quality that spoke of nerves stretched thin by the day's events. "Indeed, Miss Marple, one cannot be running to the draper's shop every time a cuff gives way." The conversation continued with the deceptive casualness that Miss Marple employed when approaching dangerous territory. She complimented the cottage's arrangement, noted the quality of the needlework, and gradually steered the discussion toward the afternoon's tragic events. Mrs. Nash maintained her composure admirably, but Miss Marple's trained eye caught the small signs of strain, the slight tremor in hands that were usually perfectly steady, the way her left wrist turned instinctively to conceal the hastily mended glove, and most significantly, the manner in which she avoided any direct contact with the mother-of-pearl button that Miss Marple had placed casually among her knitting supplies. When they returned to the manor, Miss Marple found Inspector Slack waiting with the patient expression of someone who understood that crucial revelations often emerge through indirect means rather than dramatic confrontations. The photographic evidence, combined with the observations from Mrs. Nash's cottage, had created a framework of proof that would be difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The mirror that had forgotten faces was beginning to reflect a truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of village respectability. Though Miss Marple suspected that the most crucial moment of revelation was yet to come. The evening shadows lengthened across the manor grounds as the investigation approached its climax, with all the accumulated evidence pointing toward a solution that would expose the careful calculation behind what had appeared to be a spontaneous tragedy. Someone among their seemingly respectable gathering had planned Mrs. Vane's murder with meticulous attention to detail, and Miss Marple was now prepared to demonstrate exactly how that plan had been executed and why it had been deemed necessary by a mind desperate to protect secrets that could not bear exposure. The evening had settled into an expectant quiet when Inspector Slack arranged what Miss Marple gently suggested might be called a small reconstruction in Mrs. Pierce's drawing room. The broken cheval glass from the powder tent had been carefully transported and positioned near the tall windows, its cracked surface catching the lamplight like frozen lightning. On the polished mahogany table lay the accumulated evidence of the afternoon's tragedy, the black lacquer compact in its official envelope, Mr. Rudge's precious contact strip, the mother-of-pearl button from the rose walk, and the fragment of cotton wool with its telltale thread of shell-pink silk. The assembled company formed an irregular circle that might have resembled a village committee meeting were it not for the gravity that weighted every gesture and glance. Mrs. Pierce sat with rigid composure, while Lionel hovered behind her chair, his earlier nervousness now replaced by the dawning relief of a man whose innocence was becoming apparent. Dr. Morland maintained his position near the fireplace with professional patience, and Harold Beamish kept to the room's periphery, his precise manner unchanged despite the afternoon's revelations. Mrs. Nash, ever efficient, had positioned herself near the tea service, her movements carrying the same careful grace that had marked her behavior throughout the tragic day. Miss Marple approached the reconstruction with a gentle authority that had resolved countless village mysteries over the years. "One grows so confused by descriptions," she said apologetically, settling her handbag beside her chair. "I find a little practical demonstration so helpful for clarifying these matters. Mrs. Hartley, would you be so kind as to show me how you might turn this awkward mirror if you wish to spare someone distress?" Mrs. Hartley obligingly demonstrated the natural movement, grasping the frame's upper edge and turning the glass aside with brisk efficiency. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple nodded. "Quite as I imagined." She then turned to young Daphne with the same gentle request, and the girl showed how shock had prompted her to push the mirror's face toward the wall with a single, instinctive motion of her right hand placed low on the frame. "Now, Mrs. Nash," Miss Marple continued with careful courtesy, "you know this contraption better than any of us, having presided over the powder tent with such admirable efficiency. Would you indulge an old woman by showing us how you would position it for privacy?" Mrs. Nash approached the mirror with her characteristic competence, placing her left hand against the frame at shoulder height, while her right hand guided the glass in a practiced movement that spoke of familiarity with the mechanism. Inspector Slack stepped forward with the contact strip, holding it where the lamplight would reveal its details most clearly. This photograph, taken at 2 minutes before 3 o'clock, shows a woman in light-colored clothing at the powder tent entrance during the crucial period when it was unattended, he announced with official gravity. The image captures distinctive jewelry, 3 bright points at the wrist where mother-of-pearl buttons caught the afternoon light, and the unmistakable crescent shape of a marcasite ring with a missing stone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the air above the mirror's frame where a faint scratch marred the polished wood. "Marcasite, when a stone is lost, leaves the tiniest claw," she observed with gentle precision. "Such a pity when it makes a mark like this." Her eyes, bright but kind, rested momentarily on Mrs. Nash's right hand, where the narrow crescent of grey stones showed a gap in its setting. The revelation unfolded with the inexorable logic that Miss Marple employed when exposing carefully hidden truth. Mrs. Vane's death was not the result of sudden passion or random malice, she explained with compassionate directness. It was the calculated act of someone who understood that exposure meant the destruction of everything they had built through years of patient deception, someone who had helped Marion Beckett disappear after her disgrace, just as Marion had helped them establish a new identity when their own past became untenable. Mrs. Nash's careful composure began to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence and gentle scrutiny. The efficient woman who had maintained perfect control throughout the afternoon's tragic events now faced the collapse of the carefully constructed world she had built in their peaceful village. "You recognized each other, didn't you?" Miss Marple continued with the quiet certainty that commanded attention. "Two women with compromised pasts, supporting each other's deceptions until Harold Beamish's arrival threatened to expose you both. Mrs. Vane's inquiries about your background this past week, her growing agitation about someone from her past, she was beginning to suspect that her guardian angel had become her greatest threat. The confession, when it came, poured out with the relief of someone who had carried an unbearable burden for too long. Mrs. Nash's mask finally slipped entirely, revealing the desperate fear that had driven her to murder. She was going to tell them everything, she whispered, her voice breaking with years of suppressed anxiety. When Beamish recognized her, she panicked completely. She said she couldn't bear another scandal, that she would have to confess everything to clear her conscience. She didn't care that it would destroy me too, that I would lose everything I'd built here. The full story emerged in fragments of anguish and justification. Mrs. Nash had indeed been dismissed from her previous position under circumstances that made future employment impossible without references she could not honestly obtain. Mrs. Vane, then Marion Beckett, had helped her create the identity of a respectable widow with a small pension, just as Mrs. Nash had helped her disappear after her own disgrace. They had maintained their secret for years, each dependent upon the other's silence, until Harold Beamish's recognition shattered the delicate balance that had kept them both safe. "I prepared the poison powder days ago," Mrs. Nash continued, her voice now steady with the calm that follows confession. "I knew her habits, her vanity, the way she always touched up her appearance when nervous. When she returned from meeting Beamish in such distress, I simply waited for the right moment to make the substitution. The brief errand to fetch change provided the perfect opportunity. Witnessed, corroborated, entirely innocent. I never intended for young Daphne to find her, or for the investigation to focus on poor Lionel Pierce." Inspector Slack moved forward with the quiet authority of the law, though his expression showed the regret that accompanied the arrest of someone who'd been driven to desperate measures by circumstances largely beyond their control. As Mrs. Nash was led away into the gathering darkness, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that secrets had a tendency to multiply and corrupt, creating webs of deception that eventually ensnared everyone they touched. The mirror that had forgotten faces had finally reflected the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, revealing how past sins could echo through the years to create new tragedies in the most peaceful of settings. The beautiful Mrs. Vane had paid the ultimate price for her past mistakes, but she had not been the only victim of the circumstances that had brought them all together in this quiet village where appearances had mattered more than truth, and where the careful maintenance of respectability had ultimately led to murder, most foul. The morning after Mrs. Nash's arrest dawned with a peculiar clarity that often follows the resolution of long-held mysteries, as if the very air had been cleansed of deception and could finally carry truth without distortion. Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Pierce's morning room, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm while she reflected on the curious chain of events that had led from a charity garden fete to the exposure of secrets that had festered for years beneath the surface of village respectability. Inspector Slack, preparing for his return to Much Benham with Mrs. Nash now in custody, paused to express his gratitude for assistance that had proven invaluable in unraveling what might otherwise have remained an unsolved tragedy. "Without your observations about the small details, Miss Marple, we might have arrested the wrong person entirely," he admitted with professional honesty. The evidence against young Pierce seemed so compelling, yet it was the accumulation of tiny inconsistencies that pointed toward the truth. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served through careful observation rather than dramatic revelation. "One learns, Inspector, that the most significant truths often lie hidden in the smallest details. Mrs. Nash was a clever woman who understood how to use her reputation for efficiency and helpfulness as the perfect disguise for her desperate actions. Fear can make people do extraordinary things to protect what they believe they cannot live without. The news of Mrs. Nash's arrest had spread through Melford like ripples in a still pond, transforming the quiet village's shock into a complex mixture of disbelief and unsettling self-examination. People spoke in hushed tones, rehashing every interaction they had ever had with the woman they had trusted to organize their charity events and tend their church flowers, searching for signs they had all missed. The fate, once a symbol of community spirit, had become forever marked by tragedy, its memory now inseparable from the deadly deception that had played out beneath its cheerful facade. Young Daphne Rowe, still shaken by her role in discovering the tragedy, but grateful for the resolution that had cleared Lionel Pierce of suspicion, approached Miss Marple with earnest curiosity. "I keep thinking about how Mrs. Nash seemed so helpful throughout everything," she said wonderingly. "She made tea, organized the witnesses, even helped comfort me. How could someone do such terrible things while appearing so kind?" Miss Marple's response carried the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature in all its complexity over many decades. Mrs. Nash had built a new life here, earned respect and position, found peace after years of disgrace. When that security was threatened, she chose to preserve it through any means necessary. It's a pattern one sees repeated, though usually in less dramatic circumstances. She showed you the person she wished to be, perhaps even believed herself to be. Dr. Morland, who had remained to ensure all medical aspects of the case were properly documented, observed that sometimes it was the flaws that revealed what needed to be seen most clearly. Like that broken mirror, he mused thoughtfully. Its damaged condition made it more revealing than any perfect reflection might have been. Harold Beamish, preparing for his return to London with the sobering knowledge that his quest for justice had inadvertently precipitated a greater tragedy, reflected on the unintended consequences of righteous intentions. Miss Marple's counsel was characteristically gentle but firm. "We cannot change the past, Mr. Beamish, nor can we always predict how our actions will affect others. You acted from duty, just as Mrs. Nash acted from fear. Both motivations were understandable, though the consequences proved tragic." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the manor grounds, now quiet and peaceful once again, Miss Marple gathered her belongings and prepared for her return to St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Pierce, still struggling to comprehend how someone she had trusted could have committed such a calculated crime, walked with her toward the gate where the bus would carry her home. "How do we ever really know anyone?" Mrs. Pierce asked with the bewilderment of someone whose faith in human nature had been shaken. Miss Marple paused at the wrought iron gate, her hand resting lightly on its surface. "We know people as well as they allow us to know them. The tragedy is that Mrs. Nash never found a way to become the person she wished to be honestly, without the deception that ultimately destroyed her." As the bus carried Miss Marple away from Melford Manor, she reflected on the curious way that mirrors, whether made of silvered glass or human perception, could both reveal and conceal truth depending upon the angle from which one chose to look. The mirror that had forgotten faces had ultimately remembered everything that mattered, serving as the silent witness that helped expose murder disguised as tragic accident. In the end, it was not the dramatic revelations about hidden identities that solved the case, but the accumulation of small inconsistencies: a damaged ring, a mended glove, a telling photograph, the subtle language of human behavior. Mrs. Nash's desperate attempt to preserve her carefully constructed world had destroyed not only Mrs. Vane but ultimately herself, proving once again that deception, no matter how skillfully maintained, eventually reflects back upon those who practice it. As Miss Marple settled into her seat for the journey home, her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, creating order from chaos, one careful stitch at a time. The mystery had been solved, justice served, and life would continue with its endless capacity for both tragedy and redemption. Human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, remained as readable as ever to those who knew how to look beyond surface reflections to the truth beneath.